Hey everyone, back here in period number 8, and today's topic is a little misleading because the Cold War from 1945 to 1980 is super expansive. I mean, there's tons of information there. So we aren't going to cover everything that happens in the Cold War in that time frame. We're really going to focus on earlier policies, things from the 1940s and 50s. But the topic is meant to get us thinking about the continuities and changes in Cold War policies during that time period. So going from the end of World War II, 1945, to all the way up to the 1980s. Which is really getting toward the end of the Cold War, although not the actual final end of it, but pretty close to it. So again, we're going to focus on earlier policies today. We're going to relate them to longer term things so that we can see some of those continuities and changes across that time period. But let's go ahead and dive in. Again, this is topic 8.2. We're looking at period 8, topic number 2. So let's dive in. As always, I've provided notes here on the left-hand side. We've got our objectives and our historical developments over here. I have developed a question to go along with each historical development. So as we read the historical development, we can think about this question and look at some of the evidence and processes that come up with it. So that is what we're going to do. So number 1, historical development number 1 that matches up with this learning objective says, U.S. policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union, seeking to limit the growth of communist military power and ideological influence, create a free market global economy, and build an international security system. So real quick, I want to jump into your textbook and look at the introductory paragraph for chapter 25, section A. Okay, it poses 2 really good questions that we're going to be examining throughout this objective. Okay, and so let me read it out loud to you. I'm reading this section right here. Okay, it says, the Cold War began on the heels of World War II and ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. While it lasted, this conflict raised 2 critical questions at the center of global history. Question number 1, what conditions and whose interests? How do I get that thing to go away? There we go. What conditions and whose interests would determine the balance of power in Europe and Asia? And so the interests we're talking about are the interests of the United States or the West and the interests of the Soviet Union, the East. The other question is, how would the developing nations, European colonies in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, gain their independence and take their places on the world stage? So the 2 powers in the world fighting for dominance are the United States, free market, democracy, and the Soviet Union, an authoritarian state, communism. Those 2 powers are going to be kind of leading the world in terms of how it's going to develop over the next few years. And there's a concern on both sides that the other will gain more power and influence. Okay, so those are 2 really good questions to look at as we examine this topic. So let's jump over the notes. The question posed is, why did the U.S.-Soviet relationship fall apart? Because if you remember, during World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were allies, both fighting against Nazi Germany. So what happened? We talked about that a little bit in the last video, the post-war diplomacy. I guess that would have been 2 videos ago. But I want to look at a couple more things that developed a little bit later on. So in the post-war era, power was divided between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in post-war Europe, meaning Europe was destroyed. And so the governments were broken down, infrastructure was broken down, and so the 2 powers had to vie for control over those two areas. They both were administrators over those areas. And so I think we've got a map here. Yep, here it is. Okay, so if we look at this map, which I showed you this before, we've got Western Europe and what we call Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Um, the east side is controlled by the Soviets. The west side is controlled by the United States and its allies. Okay, this is showing NATO and Warsaw Pact, which are two alliances that you guys will need to know that you're going to read about. But this is a good visual for geographically what we're looking at. And so when the war ends, both sides are trying to gain power and influence over their respective areas and the kind of in the middle areas of Europe. Really, the city of Berlin, if you see here, is a microcosm of what was going on in the world. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was divided east and west. East Berlin was administered by the Soviets, and West Berlin was administered by the US and its allies, the British and the French. And so that city, which is the flashpoint of an early conflict in the Cold War, served as a really kind of miniature version of what was going to be going on worldwide. So you guys will examine that more as you read and watch your videos. Okay, another issue that helped or that led to the relationship between these two countries falling apart was the use of the atomic bomb. This is the most powerful weapon in the world. The US uses it on Japan, and now the Soviets and the rest of the world know that the ultimate kind of measure of war is going to be the use and the acquisition and use of this catastrophic weapon. And so, although it brings peace by ending the war, the dropping of the bomb really um, kind of starts this era of extreme uncertainty because at the flash of a bomb, countries and cities can be completely destroyed, and so that changes how countries view each other, especially how countries view the United States, and it becomes a race to acquire more of these weapons and kind of a sense of anxiety that arises in countries because of that. So took a great course in college about the Cold War, and I remember the professor. She said that the Cold War started when the bomb was dropped, and historians debate when exactly the Cold War started. Some of them go all the way back to the Russian Revolution. Some of them look even past the dropping of the bomb. A lot of them point to the conferences at Yalta and Potsdam, but um, this particular teacher, she said that the start of the war was when the bomb was dropped, because at that point, we kind of drew a line in the sand of countries that were going to be extremely powerful and dangerous with the bomb and those without, and it really set up the race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So, good thing to consider there. So, in terms of documents that we're looking at, there's a really good one in your book that helps kind of illustrate the falling apart of this relationship, and that's George Kennan's Long Telegram. That's a document you should know. It'd be a good piece of evidence to use in an essay. You guys can read that telegram on your own, but in it, Kennan is describing the dangers of the Soviet Union, and it is very influential, much like, oh, another telegram we looked at, the Zimmerman telegram, although totally different war, totally different issue. It was a message that outlined a problem. The Zimmerman note was obviously Germany recruiting Mexico to fight us in the war. That was a very clear threat. But in this particular note, Kennan is more or less describing why the Soviet Union was dangerous and why the U.S. had to form a foreign policy that was focused on the kind of containment and stopping of the Soviet Union's expansion. So when that is seen and understood, it becomes very, very influential. Okay. Just case in point, here's one of his points here. He says all Soviet propaganda beyond Soviet security sphere is basically negative and destructive. It should therefore be relatively easy to combat it by any intelligent and really constructive program. So he's framing up how the U.S. should resist the Soviets and communism. Okay, and so that is a really influential document. It's a really good document. You guys need to take a look at that. Okay, and bottom line, the U.S. had to contain the spread of communism. That policy did not make the Soviets happy. And so we see that relationship fall apart as time goes on. It really falls apart quickly at the end of the war. Okay, next development here. As post-war tensions dissolved the wartime alliance between Western democracies and the Soviet Union, the U.S. developed a foreign policy based on collective security, international aid, and economic institutions that bolstered non-communist nations. Don't need to spend a lot of time on this. I've included a few examples here. The question I posed was, how did the U.S. combat communism diplomatically? These are actions, events that you guys need to be aware of. I've listed them here and in the parentheses. I'll describe them briefly, but a lot of that is going to be work you guys need to do on your own to know these things. So number one, we've got the Marshall Plan. That's an early diplomatic program or diplomatic action designed to demonstrate the U.S.'s stance against Soviet communism. It was money given to European nations to rebuild themselves after the war. Money was also offered to the Soviet Union, by the way, and they declined it. But this was a plan to give billions of dollars to Europe to rebuild after the war. Seems like a really nice gesture, benevolent, charitable, which it was, but there was an underlying message of, hey, everybody, we're going to help you rebuild so that you can resist communism, so you can resist the Iron Curtain, as Churchill said, of Soviet Russia. Another thing the U.S. did was it promised aid and support to anyone who's threatened by communism. Okay, this is known as the Truman Doctrine. That's another key term that you need to be aware of. This played out early on in the Berlin crisis as the U.S. offered aid to West Berliners who were subject to the draconian lockdown of Soviet Russia. But this is really just an overarching, kind of like the Roosevelt corollary or the Monroe Doctrine. This is just an overarching statement of how the U.S. is going to approach communism and how communism affects other nations. And so Truman says, if you are threatened by communism, we will help you. Similar to how, in the Monroe Doctrine, if you're coming over to the Western Hemisphere, you are subject to us, standing against you. Okay. The idea of if this thing happens, the U.S. will respond in this way. Okay. It's important to note that not everyone agreed with how the U.S. was overtly and openly fighting against communism. There's a document in your book, document 25-2, that outlines that. It's a really good example of how the U.S. or how not everyone in the U.S., policymakers, civilians, not everyone agreed with how the U.S. approached defending or fighting against communism. And so take a look at that. That'll be helpful. The last thing here that we have notes on is concerned by expansionist communist ideology and Soviet repression. The U.S. sought to contain communism through a variety of measures, including major military engagements in Korea. We often say that the Cold War was a war that had no, open fighting, and that's true in that the U.S. and the Soviet Union did not openly fight or fire on each other, but they did hold what were called proxy wars and wars where the U.S. was fighting communism in other places, or the Soviets were trying to establish communism in other places. Okay, and so the first, starting in 1950, was what's often called the Forgotten War, and that's the Korean War. There's a good section that I mentioned to you, I think yesterday on Classroom in Khan Academy. There's numerous videos videos and articles that show the development of the Korean War over time. Some of you may have grandparents who fought in the Korean War. It was a very big conflict that often gets forgotten in U.S. history. But there's a good video. You guys can take a look at that. Good article. There's a section in your book that I described on Classroom. You guys should have read that already. The Korean War is a perfect example of how the U.S. was willing to intervene when a country was threatened by communism. And in the case of the Korean War, the U.S. wasn't necessarily victorious, and they didn't lose. The stalemate happened at the divide between North and South Korea, where it still exists today. Um, that is, 38th parallel. That's where those two are divided. So the U.S. stopped North Korea, communist North Korea, from overtaking the whole peninsula, but it did not establish the peninsula as a communist-free place. And um, so that's early. Later on, we see Vietnam. There was a short answer essay. I'll circle that, underline it, and write S A E. It's almost as bad as my handwriting on the board. Okay, there was a short answer essay a few years ago that asked students to compare the Korean War to the Vietnam War, similarities, differences, that sort of thing. So we'll talk about Vietnam later, but those are both examples of the U.S. Getting involved militarily in the fight against communism. So another way the U.S. does that is it builds up its nuclear weapons stash. Bombs get bigger; we make more of them. Eventually, the Soviet Union gets nuclear weapons, and they build many of those. So it becomes an arms race, with the U.S. taking the lead there, both in terms of nuclear weapons and military technology overall. I think in 1947, the U.S. breaks the sound barrier. We develop a jet that is so fast; it's faster than the speed of sound. That's it's never really used in combat, but that is a big deal, as it shows how technologically superior we are. Later on, we have a program called Star Wars, which we'll talk about later. It's not as cool as it sounds. Well, it might be, depending on how you look at it, but we are showing our technological power over the rest of the world. We get satellites and the race to the moon, and that's all part of kind of military or kind of tangible physical action against communism. It's important to note, and this is really kind of looking down here at our last development, that there is a rise and fall of military action throughout the Cold War. There's times when there's a lot of military movement and action going on, and there's times where there's not. At times called détente. You think about like the um, kind of 1960s, before Vietnam, and later on in the 70s when Jimmy Carter's president. We've got just a slowdown of Cold War action. The ebbs and flows. It's a rise and fall of kind of direct and indirect military confrontation. Sometimes the Cold War is really, really quiet, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's really aggressive and loud. And so that is um, topic 8.2, kind of an overview of the Cold War. Take a look at all that reading. Take a look at Khan Academy. Be helpful to you guys. And we'll look at 8.3 later on.